Since the dawn of civilization, we have sought to understand the world by recording it. From the first impressions on clay tablets in Mesopotamia to the meticulous scrolls of empire and monastery, humanity has always captured the traces of life. These were not merely records. They were tools of memory, of power, and of continuity. Once, information served kings and priests. Now, it fuels algorithms and empires in the cloud. We live in a world governed not only by laws, but by code, where the unseen architectures of digital power decide what we see, what we desire, even what we believe. Data has brought miracles, cures for diseases, maps of the universe, and voices to the voiceless. But it also casts shadows of surveillance, of inequality, of control. Data today lies at the core of new forms of power, defining new conflicts and shaping possible futures. Every step we take, every word we whisper, every heartbeat tracked, becomes part of this immense, invisible infrastructure shaping the rhythms of modern life. We live in a time where everything can become data. But what is data? And why does it matter so much?
So data is what happens when everyday life has to be turned into discrete information.
I think human beings observe other human beings doing things, or we observe things in nature like the weather, and we figured out a way to transform them into a material record. And what's important about this record is that we can act upon it. We can use it basically to try to manage other human beings or manage nature. So data in itself is sort of like a tool that in some ways allows us to control the world around us.
Throughout history, humans have classified the world in order to make sense of it. But in the digital age, classification has been accelerated, automated, and monetized.
Data is basically ways of categorizing the world. Human beings have been classifying the world since the beginning of time, because it's not possible to live in the world unless you classify it. You need, for that purpose, stable categories. So you need to know when you get up in the morning that the thing you called an apple yesterday is still called an apple today. It's not suddenly been called a pear because some king decided to change the name. And for more than 100 years, anthropologists and sociologists have been arguing that the categories that we use in society are very important for forming the types of society that we have.
But fundamentally, data is raw information, which has value when combined with millions of other data points, as well as millions of other types of data points. And then together, that has value. So yeah, fundamentally data is raw information which delivers relevancy, but can also deliver addiction and manipulative ads. So, you know, data isn't good or bad, it's how the platform uses it.
Some compare data to oil, a raw material that fuels a new kind of global economy.
So the idea that data is, you know, this key input, this new resource that's crucial to the global economy, just the same way that oil is and things like that. And then we start thinking about, well, oil isn't just lying about ready to be used. It has to be captured. It has to be put into barrels. It often requires vast infrastructures, huge amounts of investment to actually get oil. And then we have to transport it around the world. We have to refine it. We have to do all these sorts of processes to make it actually usable for companies, for the global economy.
But the digital world doesn't run on abstractions. It needs minerals, energy, and matter. A physical infrastructure behind every click.
Data is natural resources. Data is copper, data is silicon, data is tantalum, data is water.
So what exactly is data today? And how do we define it in the age of computation?
One way of defining data is that it's just information that's been encoded in a way that makes it possible to process it with computers, information technologies. Information about people, information about markets, information about the general state of things in society.
The data that's being gathered today, that's being used to categorize us, is data that's being continuously gathered from us at all times on countless different levels, many levels that we know nothing about. And it's being aggregated, it's being put together in ways to form pictures of the types of people we are and the types of actions we perform that are completely beyond our knowledge. And this is being done not by people or even institutions that we know, but by completely unknown institutions operating far at a distance from us. And this changes fundamentally the types of power relations that are operating in today's society. That's the society we're living in, and that's why we need to understand what data is, what it has been in the past, and how radically different it is today.
Long before Google knew everything about people, empires were already obsessed with knowing who they ruled, not to protect, but to count, tax, and control. We used to think of data as something neutral, a tool for progress, for efficiency. But what if we were wrong? Today, data is not just collected, it's extracted, accumulated, and even weaponized. It shapes the choices we make, the rights we can claim, even the freedoms we unknowingly surrender. And while states struggle to keep up, a new kind of empire has risen, not built on territory, but on code, storage, and algorithms. Cloud empires. They govern the digital spaces we inhabit, set the rules we follow, remaining largely beyond our control. How did this happen? Who controls the data? And what do they do with it?
Because data is part of knowledge, and knowledge is power, it's not surprising that states have wanted to gather data about their citizens since states started to emerge.
Ancient empires invented things like postal networks and writing and mathematics to govern their holdings. European nation states in the era of the rise of nation states invented statistics, that is to say, information about the state of society in general, so that they could manage society.
They want to know stuff about everyone that they have sort of jurisdiction over, and want to make everything that's sort of under their domain legible in a way that makes it easier to do things like get taxes or kind of divide up land into pieces of property so that they can get taxes again. So a lot of the kind of foundational developing sort of statistics is tied up in this idea of kind of wanting to know and measure groups of people, communities, turning people into populations.
One of the first references to data that I found that was quite interesting was how the Spanish Empire referred to the books that they used to keep track of the resources that were being extracted from the New World as libros de cargo y data. And it's very interesting to me that we find the insertion of that word 500 years ago. In Spanish, we would refer to data as datos most frequently. But the use of this word, libros de cargo y data, to signify that the management of materials from the New World had to be recorded in a certain way so that those materials could be processed, so that things could be done with them. So even from the beginning, we have the insertion of this word to signify the transfer and the management of goods from one part of the world to the other.
But when did this obsession with data begin to escalate, turning record keeping into something far more powerful?
For instance, when European governments datify citizens, taking information about their when they were born or when they die, they were taking this into books, and we consider that datification because they were taking data from the citizens. And but then with the introduction of computers and the internet, then we had digitalization, and this is when datification met digitalization with these Excel sheets, because now governments are not taking this data into books anymore, but they are taking that into Excel sheets.
The novelty, I would say, of the online world and the digital world is just the ease of collecting data. It's become much, much simpler to be able to monitor production processes, to be able to monitor how goods are being sold, how they're being used and tracked and moved around the world. All of this sort of stuff has made it much easier to collect more data and then sort of making, greater analysis on the basis of that data.
Colonial empires shaped generations. And while we might have thought this outdated model was behind us, today we are forced to reconsider certain contemporary parallels.
Remember that historical colonialism was based around a land grab, taking whole continents and suddenly realizing they were there for the taking. If you told yourself that story, and as long as you used enough violence or other means available, you could take that land, whatever came with the land, and the bodies to work the land.
Basically, data colonialism is an emergent social order in which the continuous extraction of data from our lives is transformed into wealth for some people and ways of oppressing other populations. It might seem strange to put these two words together because, of course, data refers to something of the present, of something of the future. Colonialism, as we know, of course, refers to something of the past. But what we're trying to do in putting together this concept is to point to the continuities in the history, in a 500-year history of extractivism. So we're not making a direct connection. We are not saying data colonialism follows the exact same patterns that we saw with historic colonialism. We are more interested in tracing these continuities, how today the appropriation of data replicates in some ways, not exactly the same, the appropriation of territory. So we've gone from a situation where the resource that was really important was land, territory, the natural resources that came with it, gold, silver, etc., and the human labor that came with it. Now, of course, we have a new step in this evolution in which data colonialism is not about acquiring land, but about acquiring data. Data from our lives, data from the social world.
The data territory, I think we can see as a new stage of the colonial expansion of power. That in fact almost every app we put on our phone today is a territory that enables the continuous and exclusive extraction of data, and not just any data, but as much data as possible, so that data can be sold on for profit to people who we are certainly not interacting with as we think we operate in these data territories. This was the crucial change that radically changed power relations around data, potentially forever.
In the 21st century, data no longer lives in state archives. It flows through private servers. And the rules of this new world are not written by parliaments, but by platforms.
Now that economies and our lives in general have increasingly moved to the digital sphere, our territorial nation-state governments have in some ways been left out of the loop. Instead, we have the rise of tech companies that are collecting all this data about us and enforcing rules in the digital sphere. And that's why I call them cloud empires.
But this is taking over the organization of many, many areas of everyday life. Think about Uber. It started as a corporation that was designed to take over from the running of normal taxi companies that have existed in cities and towns ever since the car existed. But Uber created a platform. It didn't own any cars. It didn't employ any drivers, so it said. What it did was create a data platform where the price at which the driver wanted to offer the ride was able to match the price at which the passenger wanted to take the ride. So this matching market system enabled through data exchange on a platform led, as we know, to a complete transformation of private transport in cities all around the world. And of course, once you start with that model, because we're talking about data here rather than assets like cars, there's no reason why Uber can't expand into other forms of transport like train journeys, bus journeys, and this is exactly what it's trying to do. Uber Eats, the moving of food through private transport. These platforms are not just very powerful in gathering data, but because they're based around using data, aggregating it, using it in very large systems, often driven by AI, they can acquire enormous size. They can acquire monopoly power. And we've seen this in the transport sector, and we're seeing it in many other sectors. But this is taking over the organization of many, many areas of everyday life.
In 2013, former NSA contractor Edward Snowden exposed a secret. Governments around the world were using private tech companies to conduct mass surveillance. Not just of threats, but of everyone. Entire populations were being monitored through smartphones, emails, cloud servers, often without their knowledge and without a warrant. But the most unsettling truth wasn't just the scale. It was that none of it broke the law. This surveillance wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was embedded in the system, legal, profitable, and even normal. So if watching everyone has become the norm, who's really watching the watchers?
States are, of course, still very powerful. They're still gathering a lot of data, although, as we found out with Snowden's revelations in 2013, often the data they're gathering is data they rely on commercial corporations gathering in the first place, and then they hope to get a back door into that data so that they can use it too.
The problem with these cloud empires, these large tech companies that essentially play the role of the government, is that they are not accountable to the people whom they govern. So they are able to abuse our private information in ways that we wouldn't allow our government to use it. They are able to extract high fees from small businesses, and they are able to, in all kinds of ways, abuse their government-like position in the digital economy.
A lot of these marketplaces are opaque, dark tunnels where nobody knows what happens in them except for the big tech company themselves. Google does what it wants, just by way of example. and it's able to do what it wants because only Google knows how its various markets function, like its ads market. Google can charge advertisers what it wants, and advertisers are none the wiser because they're given information on their advertising monetization only as what Google sees fit. So a lot of online markets are still the wild, wild west, and these markets are run by algorithms and they're opaque, and that opacity, the lack of disclosure, the lack of sunlight has allowed them to do what they want.
So cloud infrastructure is a global network of data centers, and it combines with these infrastructure tools and development tools. So the companies can run the infrastructure resource from the cloud providers.
2/3 of the planet's population has now daily connection to the internet and different sources of social media. What began as simple tools to connect people now quietly shape how things work, far from public debate or democratic oversight.
In some ways, the relationship between states and corporations is reversed because states today require a lot of assistance from private interests to manage the data they need to run the state, to administer the nation. So we need to continue to push for governments to pass the kind of regulation that protects our interests. But at the same time, we know that that's not going to be enough. So we also need to engage in direct forms of protests against corporations and against states to defend our interests in the long terms, especially when they concern public data that is extracted from us for the purposes of understanding society better.
Because when data are used against us, we are losing also our ability to decide about our future. When data are used to track or to surveil us, we are losing what it is considered a digital human right, and not always we are aware that this is happening. But it is also the data power we have. It is also the ability to use that data to decide, for instance, who is the person we can vote for, or use our data power to ask for laws, ask for norms that are protecting our rights as digital citizens.
So governments are in an increasingly vulnerable position today in their relations to corporations, and this is making problematic the sorts of big regulation that we saw earlier in the 20th century when large companies were broken up. There was talk of that today, but it's not really clear that's going to happen. Why? Because states are increasingly dependent on those very same platforms and the big tech companies that lie behind them to generate the data that governments need to govern.
As tech giants expanded their reach into every corner of daily life, political leaders began to show some concern. For the first time, warnings came not from activists or academics, but from the very heart of global power.
That's why my farewell address tonight, I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. And that's the dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. The dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead.
Well, what happens now? You see what's happening now. People are working more and more, and people are more and more unhappy, more and more nervous, more and more aggressive. Why? What's happened? Automation was supposed to reduce time of labor. Actually, automation is increasing time of labor. Why? It's an enigma. It's an enigma up to a certain point, you know, because the point is the use of technology, of automation, of machines, does not depend on nature, depends on who is the master, who is the boss. If the owner of technology is Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, you can be sure that more technology, more suffering, more work, more labor, more exploitation, more money for them. That is the point.
Beyond its psychological and emotional toll, the threats we face today pose a deeper risk, one that undermines not only our individual well-being, but the collective future of humanity itself.
It is possible now to look at various forms of lethality in the world, not just the kind of faint sound of guns and explosives that are part of a military lethality, but the lethality of exclusion, the roaring lethality of climate change. So it's possible to see, different from the kind of apparatus that we usually think of as the national apparatus, whether it's nation building or war making. It's possible to see kind of distributed forms of lethality in different ways.
Never before has humanity produced so much information at such relentless speed. Data now flows at the velocity of light, filling every corner of our lives, shaping our choices and eroding our sense of meaning. Artificial intelligence rises with promises of miracles, but it also deepens inequalities and devours vast resources. Around this invisible infrastructure, states and corporations wrestle for power, while ordinary people struggle to defend their freedom and forms of collective life.
AI-based algorithms are algorithmic structures that are able to identify patterns into data sets. And they are driven by mathematical and statistical functions, and they solve problems finding the most efficient or most optimal solution. Like AI needs data to be trained and to predict or forecast behaviors.
We talk about AI as if it's truly intelligent, maybe that's another question, but also artificial, highly artificial, far beyond what your mind or my mind can do. But that's a myth. A computer or an algorithm has absolutely no idea what a human face is or why it matters. It has no idea what a car looks like or why it matters. It has to be taught these things, and originally it had to be taught by human beings, endlessly saying, this is a car, this is not a car, this is an apple. Doing this again and again and again until that could be relied upon to regularly spot what is a car rather than an apple.
Today, effectively, we're throwing in the entire internet into these AI models that we use, so ChatGPT and things like that. So this is, I think, the sort of cutting edge, the leading edge of where data is under modern capitalism at the moment is these generative AI models, to the point where companies are increasingly worried that we're going to run out of data. And these companies are sort of taking data from wherever they can find it. oftentimes taking data that's not theirs, that's somebody else's data. There's a sort of Wild West moment of data right now within generative AI.
That the massive debates about whether AI is actually useful, whether it's actually intelligent, whether it actually gains anything except speeding up certain menial tasks, are not being asked. They're not being asked. And they're not being asked because the debate is almost entirely being controlled by a small number of companies, and it's not in their interest to ask these questions. But we as a society need to open up these questions because they're absolutely essential to the type of society we and our children are going to be living in the next 5, 10, 20 years. To give a simple example, a child today, age 5, who's watching their parents ask ChatGPT a simple question, and then they get into the habit of asking ChatGPT a question themselves. Will they in 20 years' time make even any sense of the idea that you go to a human being to ask the answer to a question? Or will that seem an idea they've already lost hold of? Will it by then have become totally automatic that you speak or write or perhaps just smile or look at a computer device driven by AI that has extracted all the answers that human beings have given in the past history to give the answer to that child who by then will be 25? And if that is the sort of transformation in the nature of knowledge that we're entering into, why will there be universities? Why will there be schools in 20 years' time? That's the scale of the sorts of transformation we're entering in today, because we're transforming literally the building blocks of how we know the world. And there is no more fundamental dimension of any society than that.
As the social and technological dilemma deepens, collective power is fading beneath the relentless force of innovation. What tools remain within our reach? And where do we begin to rebuild the balance?
There's all these sorts of ways in which we could use these technologies for the mass benefit of humanity, but that goes against the profit-seeking nature of companies and the profit-seeking nature of capitalism more broadly. It doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon, at least not without massive political struggles to push for it and fight for it. So if we want to actually change the world and we want to be able to take power away from big tech, we need not just political parties, but we need social movements, trade unions, and all sorts of different leaders to step up and take charge.
Already we see some seeds of something like this happening in the digital economy. For instance, e-commerce sellers and small app developers and online gig workers are organizing, and they're starting to make demands to the princes of the cloud empires to give them a say in how they are being governed. And as information about people gets encoded into data, the same must apply to data too, that the data about people must not spread to those that we wouldn't want to share it with. We need information security, ways of controlling the spread of information about ourselves.
Around the world, governments struggle to keep pace with forces they no longer command. To organize now is not a choice. It is a matter of survival.
We're increasingly seeing certain governments, particularly in the US and the EU, getting very worried. We've seen, for example, the US Surgeon General proposing that there should be a health warning with every social media platform because it's really dangerous for young people to grow up close to it. But these are just examples of the state trying to manage something that it probably lacks the power to fully manage.
We must act within the system, we must act against the system, and we must act beyond the system. So we must work within the system, which means participating in mainstream politics, as boring as that might sound, but continuing to put pressure on governments to pass regulations that benefit us instead of benefiting corporations. We must also act against the system, which means forms of protest, because corporations are not going to fix themselves. And in many cases, governments are not going to pass the regulations necessary to put controls on corporations. So forms of protest will continue to be very important, and we are seeing those already in many different forms. But of course, this might not be enough. So at the end of the day, we also need to think beyond the system, imagining completely different alternatives to what we have. And I think that's where creativity and imagination come into play, because we must imagine a different world, and a different world is possible. So we must always rely on our imagination to think beyond the constraints of our current problems.
I think that we can envision the alternative of like the right to analog. So the right to be processed by a human, the right to be datified on a paper, the right to decide not to be digitalized or be reflected into an Excel sheet.
We've traced the path of data, from ancient records to digital empires, from invisible networks to the choices that shape our daily lives. Every click, every code, every connection tells a story about who we are and what we value. But as data concentrates in fewer hands, so does power, widening the gap between those who control the systems and those who live within them. Now we stand at a vital turning point. The question is no longer what data can do, but what kind of future we want to build with it. So, what does the future hold?
The future surely has to be one in which big tech are more regulated entities, where it's not just the wild, wild west. You need nation states, governments pushing for equitable regulations as much as they can, but ultimately it's going to have to come together at a transnational level. And that's because these companies are fundamentally global entities, they're transnational entities.
I think we need to resist the narratives that present us a world of technology as a world of progress and convenience. Because we are all part of the system of data colonialism, but in different ways, we have to keep in mind that there are inequalities within the system, and some people will benefit more than others. And we need to keep in mind that we might not be the fortunate ones.
I believe that if we allow these change in power relations, if we allow the extraction of data to grow completely without limits across society, in every sector, then there is a risk we will create a society that is absolutely unlivable, where the very idea of freedom, the idea that we could exist in a space that's not watched, that isn't tracked, that we're not accountable for at some point unknown in the future to some authority that we've never even heard of, or to some corporation that we know nothing about. The idea that we could ever live in that free space could just become a memory.
But to be realistic, of course, in history, these processes unfolded over centuries. So far in the online economy, everything has developed at a manifold speed. So it might take less time in the online economy, but still it's not something that I would expect to happen in the blink of an eye.
In fact, some philosophers have suggested the greatest possible loss of freedom is not to have your freedom taken away now, but to exist in a time when you can no longer remember what it would have been like to be free. That's the deepest loss of freedom, to no longer be in touch with the concept of freedom.
The musical artist Prince once said, it's great to use the computer, but never let the computer use you.
Nobody knows what will happen in the future. But the prospect is dark, you know. Nevertheless, you always have to think about the unavoidable, but also you must remember that the unpredictable will happen.